Sometimes the thing that saves a life doesn't arrive with sirens, sometimes it arrives barking in the dark. Snow hammered against the concrete entrance of the underground parking garage beneath the Kingston Police Headquarters, the wind outside howling hard enough to shake the steel security gate every few seconds. Officer Graham Mercer adjusted the collar of his winter jacket and exhaled slowly, watching pale fog leave his mouth in the freezing air. Even underground, the cold still found its way in. Beside him, K9 Varga moved silently across the damp concrete floor, the Doberman's nails clicking softly beneath the humming fluorescent lights overhead. 12 years together, and Graham had learned to trust the dog more than most people. Varga never barked without reason. Never. The garage smelled like motor oil, melted snow, and cold metal. Midnight patrols were usually quiet this time of year. A few patrol cruisers. Maintenance workers finishing late shifts. Nothing more. Graham glanced toward the far elevator as the doors slid open with a tired metallic groan. A young officer stepped out carrying a dark navy duffel bag pressed tightly against his chest. Rookie Officer Ethan Calloway. 26. Good kid. Too quiet sometimes. Graham had noticed that about him ever since the funeral leave ended 2 weeks earlier. Ethan kept his eyes low as he crossed the garage, snow still melting from his boots. But then Varga suddenly stopped walking. The Doberman's ears lifted. His entire body stiffened. Graham felt it instantly through the leash. Easy, he muttered softly. But Varga didn't move. His dark eyes locked directly onto Ethan's bag. Then came the bark. Loud. Sharp. Explosive enough to echo through the entire garage. Ethan froze immediately. The duffel bag slipped slightly in his arms before he grabbed it tighter. Varga barked again, deeper this time, pulling hard against the leash. Graham frowned. Varga. The dog ignored him completely. That was what unsettled him most. Varga was trained to detect narcotics, firearms, explosives, human distress. But this reaction felt different. Not aggression. Panic. Ethan's face had gone pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Officer Calloway, Graham said calmly, stepping closer. What's in the bag? Nothing dangerous, Ethan answered too quickly. His voice cracked near the end. Varga barked again. Not angry. Urgent. The Doberman strained forward, nose twitching rapidly toward the zipper of the bag. Ethan took a step backward. Please, he whispered. Graham's instincts sharpened immediately. He noticed the rookie's shaking hands. The exhaustion under his eyes. The way he kept glancing toward the exit like a trapped man searching for somewhere to run. Then, a sound interrupted the silence. Faint. Weak. Barely audible beneath the storm outside. A tiny whimper. Graham's expression changed instantly. Ethan closed his eyes like the sound had broken something inside him. Another whimper came from inside the bag, followed by a thin mechanical hiss. Varga stopped barking. The Doberman suddenly moved closer, slower now, ears lowered, his breathing calm but focused. Graham stared at the duffel bag. Ethan, he said quietly. Open it. The rookie swallowed hard, snow water dripping from his sleeve onto the concrete floor. For a moment, he looked like he might collapse right there beside the patrol vehicles and flickering neon lights. Then his trembling fingers slowly reached for the zipper. And somewhere deep inside the bag, something tiny struggled to breathe. The zipper trembled in Ethan Calloway's hands. For a second, it looked like he physically could not force himself to open the bag. The storm outside groaned through the ventilation shafts overhead while fluorescent lights flickered across the concrete ceiling, washing the underground garage in pale blue shadows. Graham Mercer stood perfectly still beside Varga, watching the rookie carefully. Years in uniform had taught him how fear looked on a guilty man. This wasn't that. Ethan looked terrified, but not for himself. Another weak sound came from inside the duffel bag. Tiny. Fragile. Barely hanging on. Ethan finally pulled the zipper open halfway. Warm air escaped first, mixed with the faint smell of antiseptic, damp blankets, and something metallic from the small oxygen unit hidden inside. Then Graham saw movement beneath the layers of fabric. A tiny black and rust Doberman puppy lay curled against a heating pad wrapped in towels. An oxygen mask covered the little dog's narrow muzzle, fogging weakly with every shallow breath. Thin tubes ran from the mask to a portable oxygen cylinder no bigger than a thermos bottle, secured inside the bag with tape and winter scarves. The puppy's eyes were half open but unfocused. Exhausted. Struggling. Graham felt the air leave his lungs slowly. "Jesus," he whispered under his breath. Ethan looked down immediately, ashamed. "His name's Milo," he said quietly. Varga stepped forward before Graham could stop him. But the Doberman no longer looked alert or defensive. The big K9 lowered his head carefully toward the opening of the bag, nostrils twitching as he studied the tiny puppy. Milo gave another faint whimper at the sound of Varga's breathing. Then something changed. The old police dog slowly lowered himself onto the cold concrete beside the duffel bag. Calm. Protective. Graham had seen Varga track armed suspects through forests north of Ottawa during blizzards. He had seen the dog charge through broken glass without hesitation. But he had never seen him react like this. Varga pressed closer to the bag, allowing his body heat to drift toward the trembling puppy. Ethan's eyes filled immediately. "He likes him," he whispered, almost unable to believe it himself. Graham crouched beside the bag and checked the small oxygen monitor attached to the cylinder. The display blinked red every few seconds. Low supply. Critically low. "How long's he been like this?" Graham asked. Ethan rubbed his face with shaking hands. "Since October." His voice sounded hollow from exhaustion. "Congenital airway condition. Vet says he's still growing, his lungs can't keep up yet." Graham looked back at the puppy. Milo's breathing rattled softly beneath the mask, uneven and fragile. The little dog couldn't have weighed more than 4 kilograms. Snowmelt dripped from Ethan's jacket sleeve onto the concrete floor beside him. "You brought him into the station?" Graham asked quietly. Ethan nodded once, unable to meet his eyes. "I didn't have anybody tonight." His voice cracked hard this time. "I tried. I called everyone." Varga remained motionless beside the bag, watching the puppy with deep brown eyes that reflected the flickering overhead lights. The garage suddenly felt strangely silent despite the storm outside. No radios. No footsteps. Just the hiss of oxygen flowing through thin plastic tubing. Ethan swallowed hard. "Animal Services already warned me once," he admitted softly. "They said if I leave him alone during shifts again, they could remove him." Graham said nothing. Ethan looked down at Milo like a man staring at the last thing keeping him alive. "I know this looks bad," he whispered. "But after my wife died, he's all I got left." Then the oxygen monitor let out a sharp warning beep that echoed across the empty garage, and Milo's tiny chest suddenly struggled harder for air. The warning alarm on the oxygen unit beeped again, louder this time, the red light flashing against the damp concrete walls of the underground garage like a heartbeat running out of time. Milo's tiny chest rose unevenly beneath the blanket, each breath thinner than the last. Ethan immediately dropped to his knees beside the duffel bag, fumbling with the oxygen valve using trembling fingers that barely seemed able to function anymore. Come on," he whispered desperately. Varga stayed close beside the puppy, his large body curled protectively near the open bag while warm air drifted from his breath into the freezing garage. The Doberman's eyes never left Milo for even a second. Graham crouched beside Ethan and looked at the pressure gauge. The needle hovered dangerously low near empty. "How much backup do you have?" Graham asked quietly. Ethan shook his head without looking up. That is the backup. His voice sounded hollow. Exhausted. Defeated. Snow slammed hard against the outside entrance again, and somewhere overhead a gust of winter wind rattled the ventilation pipes with a low metallic groan. The entire garage suddenly felt colder than before. Graham removed one glove and touched Milo gently beneath the blanket. The puppy was freezing. Far too cold. Milo gave a weak cough beneath the oxygen mask, his little paws twitching faintly against the towel wrapped around him. Ethan's face crumpled instantly. He was doing better yesterday, he said softly. The vet thought maybe his lungs were finally getting stronger. Graham noticed dark circles under the rookie's eyes, the kind that came from weeks without proper sleep. There was dried salt from melted snow on Ethan's boots and coffee stains across one sleeve of his uniform jacket. Small signs of a man barely holding himself together. Varga slowly moved closer until his shoulder pressed lightly against the side of the duffel bag. Milo reacted immediately. The puppy's restless breathing eased for a moment beneath the mask. Graham stared at the Doberman in silence. He is calming him down, he murmured. Ethan wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed. Milo likes warm spaces, he whispered. After my wife passed, he stopped sleeping unless somebody stayed beside him. The words hung heavily in the cold air. Graham did not ask how long ago it happened. He could already hear the answer in Ethan's voice. The young officer looked barely older than a university student sitting there on the concrete floor beside a dying puppy and an oxygen tank that was almost empty. Varga lowered his head carefully beside the opening of the bag, his ears relaxed now, breathing slow and steady like he understood exactly what the little animal needed. The garage lights flickered once overhead. Milo suddenly coughed harder. The oxygen mask shifted sideways from his muzzle. Ethan panicked instantly. No, 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 he adjusted the mask carefully back into place while his hands shook uncontrollably. Graham reached for his radio without hesitation. Dispatch, this is Officer Mercer in underground parking level 2. I need emergency veterinary assistance immediately. Ethan looked up sharply. No, Graham turned toward him. He needs help. Ethan swallowed hard. If this gets reported, his voice cracked again. Animal Services will take him. The silence afterward hurt more than the storm outside. Graham looked at the puppy struggling to breathe beneath the mask. Then at the rookie officer sitting beside him, terrified of losing the last living thing tied to his old life. Varga suddenly lifted his head. The Doberman stared directly at Graham with sharp focused eyes, then looked back toward Milo again. Graham had seen that look before during rescue operations in northern Ontario after avalanches and winter crashes. Varga only looked at him like that when a life was slipping away. Then the oxygen monitor emitted one long continuous tone, and Milo's tiny body stopped moving beneath the blanket. For one terrible second, nobody moved. The long continuous tone from the oxygen monitor filled the underground garage like winter wind trapped inside metal walls. Ethan stared down at Milo in complete disbelief, his face drained of all color beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. No, he whispered. No, please. His hands immediately reached into the duffel bag, gently lifting the tiny Doberman puppy against his chest. Milo's small body hung limp beneath the blankets, the oxygen mask sliding sideways as the puppy's breathing faded into near silence. Ethan looked shattered. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just broken in the quietest way a human being could break. Graham moved beside him immediately. Keep the mask steady, he said firmly while grabbing his radio again. Emergency veterinary unit is en route. Estimated arrival 6 minutes. 6 minutes sounded like forever. Outside, snow continued hammering the city above them, the storm swallowing distant sirens before they could fully echo through the streets. Varga suddenly stood up beside them. The Doberman pressed close against Ethan's side, nose nudging gently beneath Milo's. blanket as if refusing to accept what was happening. Ethan's breathing became uneven. "I promised her," he whispered weakly. Graham glanced toward him. "What?" Ethan swallowed hard, unable to stop staring at the puppy. "Claire." His voice cracked at the name. "My wife." The rookie's eyes filled again, but this time the tears came slowly, silently, like exhaustion finally overpowering him. "Before she died, she made me promise I would keep him safe." Graham remained still beside him while the cold air drifted through the garage in pale waves. Ethan looked barely able to hold himself upright anymore. "She picked him," he continued softly. "Said nobody ever chose the sick ones." Milo gave a faint rattling breath against Ethan's jacket. "Tiny. Fragile. Fighting." Varga lowered himself onto the concrete again directly beside Ethan, his massive black and rust body touching the rookie's leg like silent support. The Doberman's eyes stayed fixed on the puppy. Graham had spent most of his adult life around police dogs, but moments like this still unsettled him. There was something almost human in the way Varga watched Milo struggle. Ethan brushed trembling fingers gently across the puppy's head. "After Claire passed away last November, I almost gave him up." He exhaled shakily. But every night he crawled onto her side of the bed and waited. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere deeper inside the station, a door slammed shut faintly. Life continued above them while this tiny life slipped away below ground beside concrete pillars and parked patrol cruisers. Ethan closed his eyes. I could not lose him too. Graham finally understood then. This was never about hiding a dog at work. It was grief. Raw and desperate. A young man drowning slowly while trying to keep one last promise alive. Varga suddenly shifted position. The Doberman pressed his muzzle carefully against the oxygen tubing near the valve, sniffing intensely. Then he looked sharply toward Graham and gave a low restless sound deep in his throat. Graham frowned immediately. "What is it?" Varga nudged the tubing again. "Harder this time." Graham leaned closer toward the portable tank. The hiss of oxygen sounded inconsistent now. Weak. Interrupted. He traced the clear tubing downward with his eyes until he noticed something near the bottom connector. The line had partially loosened from the portable valve during movement. Oxygen was leaking into the freezing garage air instead of reaching Milo properly. Graham's expression changed instantly. "Ethan," he said sharply. "Hold him steady." He tightened the connector firmly with both hands. A stronger flow immediately rushed back through the tubing. The oxygen mask fogged heavier against Milo's muzzle almost instantly. Then, beneath the blanket, the tiny puppy's chest rose again. Milo's chest rose again with a weak trembling breath beneath the oxygen mask, and Ethan nearly collapsed from relief right there on the cold concrete floor. He held the tiny Doberman carefully against his jacket while tears slid silently down his face. Not loud sobbing. Just the kind of quiet grief that came from carrying too much pain for too long. Graham tightened the oxygen connector one more time before checking the pressure gauge again. The leak had cost them precious supply. The needle still hovered dangerously close to empty. "How far out is emergency support?" he asked into his radio. Static crackled for a moment before dispatch answered through the speaker. "Weather conditions slowing response time. Estimated arrival now 10 minutes. Graham closed his eyes briefly. 10 minutes in this storm could become 20. Above them, snowplows scraped across frozen streets while wind battered the city with blinding white sheets of snow. Kingston winters could turn dangerous fast after midnight. Ethan looked down at Milo's small face behind the fogging mask. "He hates storms," he whispered weakly. "Claire used to hold him during thunder." Varga remained beside them, pressed close enough that his body warmth covered both Ethan and the puppy. The large Doberman had not taken his eyes off Milo once. His breathing stayed calm. Steady. Almost deliberate. Graham noticed something strange then. Milo's tiny heartbeat monitor clipped beneath the blanket had stabilized slightly since Varga moved closer. Not normal. Still fragile. But steadier. Ethan noticed it too. He is helping him, he whispered. Graham did not answer immediately. He had stopped trying to explain certain things about dogs years ago. Especially working dogs. Especially ones who had spent their lives beside human fear and suffering. Varga simply lowered his head closer to Milo and remained there like a silent guard refusing to leave his post. Another gust of freezing air swept through the garage entrance as the security gate rattled violently. The overhead lights flickered again. Ethan looked exhausted beyond words now, shoulders shaking beneath his soaked winter jacket. Graham finally removed his gloves completely and sat beside him. On the concrete floor. "How long have you been sleeping in your truck?" he asked quietly. Ethan froze. Then he gave a weak defeated laugh. "About 3 weeks." Graham nodded slowly. He had guessed something was wrong the moment he saw the rookie tonight. Ethan stared down at Milo while carefully adjusting the puppy's blanket. "Rent went up after the hospital bills." His voice sounded numb now. "I sold almost everything already." Graham remained silent. Sometimes silence let people survive conversations they otherwise could not. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. "The home oxygen unit broke yesterday." He looked ashamed saying it aloud. "I could not afford another rental until payday." Varga suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the far entrance of the garage. Seconds later, faint sirens echoed through the storm outside. Ethan exhaled shakily in relief. But Milo's monitor suddenly emitted another warning tone. Softer this time. Slower. Graham checked the oxygen cylinder again and felt his stomach tighten. Empty. Completely empty. The final reserve had run out. Ethan looked up in panic immediately. "No." Graham grabbed the emergency medical bag from the wall cabinet near the elevator while dispatch updated their arrival over the radio. 4 more minutes. 4 minutes felt impossibly far away. Milo's breathing weakened again beneath the mask. Varga stood instantly and moved closer until his muzzle rested gently against the puppy's side. The old police dog gave a low soft sound deep in his throat, almost like reassurance. Then, for the first time since opening the bag, Milo's tiny tail moved once beneath the blanket. The tiny movement of Milo's tail lasted less than a second, but it changed the entire atmosphere inside the freezing underground garage. Ethan let out a shaky breath that sounded almost like a sob while holding the puppy closer beneath his winter coat. Varga stayed pressed beside them, the Doberman's dark eyes alert beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. Outside, the storm continued roaring through downtown Kingston, snow piling against sidewalks and emergency vehicles struggling through icy streets. Graham checked his watch. The veterinary response team should have arrived already. Then headlights suddenly swept across the far wall of the garage. A white emergency transport van pushed through the security gate, tires crunching over slush and salt. 2 emergency veterinary technicians stepped out carrying insulated medical kits through the cold air. "What have we got?" one of them asked. Quickly while kneeling beside Ethan. Graham gestured toward Milo. "Severe respiratory distress. Oxygen dependent. Portable tank depleted." The technician carefully checked the puppy's breathing while the second prepared a larger oxygen system from the emergency kit. Ethan looked terrified watching strangers touch Milo, but exhaustion had drained away whatever strength he still had left to argue. "Easy," Graham said quietly beside him. "They are here to help." Varga remained motionless beside the puppy, refusing to move even when one technician nearly stepped over him. "That dog is guarding him like family," the woman murmured softly while attaching a new oxygen line to Milo's mask. Fresh oxygen flowed through the tubing almost immediately. Milo's tiny chest expanded deeper this time. A small sound escaped Ethan's throat as relief flooded through him all at once. The technician checked the puppy's gums and heartbeat monitor carefully before looking back at Graham. He needs overnight stabilization at the veterinary hospital immediately. Ethan's face tightened again. Fear returned instantly. I cannot afford emergency care, he admitted quietly. The words seemed physically painful for him to say aloud. One of the technicians paused sympathetically but did not answer right away. Everyone already understood what that silence meant. Emergency veterinary treatment during a winter storm was expensive. Graham looked toward Ethan for a long moment before reaching into his coat pocket. He removed an old worn leather wallet and handed over his credit card without saying a word. Ethan stared at him in shock. Sir. I cannot, you can pay me back someday, Graham interrupted calmly. Or maybe you do not. Ethan looked down immediately, unable to speak. Varga gently rested his head against the rookie's knee while the technicians prepared a thermal transport crate lined with blankets and portable heating packs. Milo's breathing had stabilized slightly now, but he still looked terribly weak beneath the oxygen mask. The smallest movement exhausted him. As the technicians carefully lifted the puppy into the transport crate, Varga suddenly stood up fast and blocked their path. Not aggressive. Just firm. Protective. The younger technician hesitated. Graham immediately understood. Easy, Varga. But the Doberman did not move. His eyes remained fixed on Milo inside the crate. Ethan slowly reached down and touched Varga's neck gently. It is okay, he whispered weakly. They are helping him. The old police dog stared at Ethan for another long second before finally stepping aside. But he stayed so close that his shoulder brushed the side of the crate as they walked toward the van. Snow blew inside the garage entrance in freezing white waves while emergency lights flashed silently across concrete walls. Ethan followed beside the stretcher carrying Milo, looking like a man terrified the world might take one more thing away from him before sunrise. Then, just before the technicians loaded the crate into the van, Milo weakly opened his eyes beneath the oxygen mask. And for the first time that entire night, the tiny puppy looked directly at Varga. The emergency transport van cut slowly through the storm, its headlights barely visible behind thick waves of snow blowing across the empty streets of Kingston. Ice scraped beneath the tires while freezing wind rattled against the vehicle hard enough to shake the side panels. Inside the back compartment, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic, wet winter clothing, and warmed oxygen. Ethan sat beside Milo's transport crate with both hands wrapped tightly around the edge like he was afraid the puppy might disappear if he let go. Across from him, Graham remained silent beside Varga, whose dark eyes never left the tiny Doberman inside the oxygen enclosure. The rhythmic hiss of flowing oxygen filled the cramped space between flashes of blue emergency lights reflecting across the windows. Milo's breathing sounded steadier now, but still painfully weak. Every breath seemed to take effort. Ethan looked exhausted beyond anything Graham had seen in years. Not just tired. Empty. The kind of exhaustion that reached into a person's bones after months of grief and fear without rest. Snow melted slowly from the rookie's jacket onto the rubber flooring beneath his boots. Claire used to call him her little shadow, Ethan said quietly without looking up. His voice almost disappeared beneath the storm outside. He followed her everywhere. Graham listened while Varga slowly shifted closer toward the transport crate. The Doberman rested his head beside the clear plastic opening, close enough for Milo to smell him through the oxygen flow. Ethan gave a faint broken smile watching them. He has not wagged his tail at anyone since she passed away. The emergency technician checked Milo's monitor again before adjusting the oxygen flow slightly higher. He is responding better than expected, she said softly. That is a good sign. Ethan nodded once, but the fear never left his face. Hope scared people who had already lost too much. The van suddenly jolted hard crossing an icy patch beneath an overpass. One of the oxygen tubes shifted slightly against the side of the crate. Varga reacted instantly. The Doberman stood so abruptly that the leash snapped tight in Graham's hand. A deep warning growl rumbled through his chest. "Varga," Graham said sharply. But the dog ignored him completely. Varga shoved his nose directly against the oxygen tubing again, agitated now, paw scraping against the crate floor. The technician frowned and leaned closer toward the line. "What is wrong with him?" Then she noticed it. A thin crack had formed near the portable regulator connection from the sudden impact. Oxygen was leaking quietly into the transport compartment. Barely visible. Barely audible. But enough to slowly reduce Milo's supply again. "Damn," the technician muttered while tightening the emergency backup seal. The oxygen pressure stabilized immediately. Ethan stared at Varga in disbelief. "He knew," he whispered. Graham looked at the Doberman beside him. "He always knows." Varga finally settled back down once the flow normalized again, though he kept his eyes fixed on the tubing as if refusing to trust it anymore. Outside, the veterinary hospital finally appeared through the snowstorm ahead, glowing softly against the darkness like a lighthouse in frozen fog. The van pulled into the emergency entrance where staff rushed forward beneath falling snow carrying heated blankets and equipment. As the rear doors opened, freezing air burst inside instantly. Ethan climbed out beside the transport crate while hospital staff hurried Milo through automatic glass doors into the emergency wing. But then something unexpected happened. Varga stopped walking. The Doberman stood frozen near the entrance, staring after the tiny puppy disappearing down the bright hallway beyond the glass. Graham gently touched the dog's shoulder. "Come on." But Varga did not move. For the first time all night, the old police dog looked afraid. Snow continued falling outside the veterinary hospital in thick silent sheets, covering the parking lot and nearby streets beneath layers of white that reflected softly beneath emergency lights. Inside the waiting area, everything felt strangely still after the chaos of the night. The heating vents hummed quietly overhead while pale blue light from vending machines flickered against polished floors. Ethan sat hunched forward in a plastic chair near the emergency ward doors, his hands locked tightly together, eyes fixed on the small red examination light glowing above the treatment room. He had not spoken in nearly 20 minutes. Graham remained nearby with a paper cup of untouched coffee cooling slowly in his hands. Beside him, Varga lay stretched across the floor facing the hallway where Milo had disappeared. The old Doberman had refused water. Refused food. Refused rest. Every time hospital staff opened the treatment doors, Varga's ears lifted instantly. Waiting. Watching. Hoping. A veterinary nurse finally stepped into the waiting area carrying a clipboard against her chest. Ethan stood so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. "How is he?" The nurse gave a tired but gentle smile. "He is stable for now." Ethan closed his eyes immediately, relief washing across his face so suddenly that Graham thought the young officer might collapse. "His oxygen levels are improving," she continued softly. "But he is still very fragile." Ethan nodded quickly, barely able to breathe himself now. "Can I see him?" The nurse hesitated briefly. "Normally we limit visitors in intensive care overnight." Before she could finish, Varga quietly stood up beside Graham. The Doberman stared directly at the nurse with calm focused eyes. The woman looked down at him in surprise. "That is the police dog." Graham nodded once. "He has not left the puppy's side since midnight." The nurse glanced back toward the treatment hallway. Honestly, she gave a faint exhausted smile. The staff already noticed. Ethan frowned slightly. "Noticed what?" "Every time the puppy becomes distressed," she explained quietly, "he calms down when he hears your dog outside the room." Graham looked toward Varga. The Doberman remained perfectly still beneath the fluorescent lights, snow still melting slowly from his dark coat onto the hospital floor. The nurse exhaled softly. "I should not be doing this," she admitted. "But I think the little one needs him." Minutes later, the intensive care room door slowly opened. Warm sterile air drifted into the hallway carrying the soft beeping of monitors and the faint scent of disinfectant. Milo rested inside a heated oxygen enclosure surrounded by blankets and monitoring equipment. Tubes and sensors covered his tiny body, but for the first time all night, his breathing looked calmer. Weaker than normal. But calm. Varga entered the room slowly beside Graham. The moment the Doberman approached the oxygen enclosure, Milo's small ears twitched beneath the blankets. Ethan covered his mouth immediately. Emotion breaking across his face again. Varga carefully lowered himself onto the floor beside the enclosure without making a sound. The puppy's heartbeat monitor steadied almost instantly. One of the veterinary technicians looked up from the chart in disbelief. "That keeps happening," she whispered. The room fell quiet except for the gentle rhythm of medical machines and winter wind brushing softly against the hospital windows outside. Ethan crouched beside Varga and rested one trembling hand against the old police dog's shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered weakly. Varga did not look at him. The Doberman kept his eyes fixed entirely on Milo, watching every breath the tiny puppy took beneath the soft glow of the oxygen chamber. Then, very slowly, Milo lifted his head for the first time since arriving at the hospital, and pressed his tiny paw against the glass beside Varga. 3 weeks later, the snowstorms finally began to ease across Kingston. Ice still covered the edges of sidewalks and frozen wind drifted across Lake Ontario, but the city no longer felt buried beneath endless winter darkness. Pale afternoon sunlight spilled softly through the front windows of a small rental townhouse near the eastern side of the city. Inside, warm air carried the faint smell of coffee, clean blankets, and medical oxygen. Milo slept peacefully inside a padded dog bed near the living room heater, a small home oxygen unit humming quietly beside him. The puppy looked stronger now. Still thin. Still fragile. But alive. His tiny chest rose steadily beneath the soft gray blanket while afternoon light touched the black and rust fur around his ears. Ethan sat nearby on the floor assembling medication schedules and veterinary paperwork spread across the coffee table. For the first time in months, the dark exhaustion beneath his eyes had begun to fade slightly. Not gone. But softer somehow. A knock suddenly echoed at the front door. Ethan stood quickly and opened it to find Graham Mercer outside in his winter coat with Varga sitting calmly beside him on the porch. The old Doberman immediately stepped forward the second the door opened, moving inside with quiet purpose like he already knew where he was needed. Ethan smiled faintly. He remembered the place. Graham removed snow from his boots near the entrance. He has been restless all week. Varga crossed the living room slowly before stopping beside Milo's bed. The tiny puppy stirred almost immediately. At the sound of familiar footsteps. Then Milo opened his eyes and weakly lifted his head. His tail began wagging softly against the blanket. Ethan laughed under his breath, the sound rusty from not being used enough lately. That is the fastest he has moved all morning. Varga lowered himself carefully beside the puppy, resting against the side of the bed while Milo pressed closer into the warmth of the older dog's chest. The oxygen tubing shifted gently between them beneath the afternoon sunlight. Graham watched quietly for a moment before handing Ethan a large envelope. "What is this?" Ethan asked carefully. "Open it." Inside was an official letter from Regional Animal Welfare Services along with documents from the veterinary hospital. Ethan read silently for several seconds before his hands began shaking again. "Home care assistance," he whispered. Graham nodded once. The hospital submitted a recommendation after reviewing everything. Ethan looked stunned. "They are not taking him." "No," Graham glanced toward Milo. "They approved medical support funding instead." Ethan lowered himself slowly into the nearest chair like his legs no longer trusted him. For several seconds he could not speak at all. The room remained quiet except for the soft hum of the oxygen machine and distant winter wind brushing against the windows outside. Ethan finally looked toward Graham with wet eyes. "Why would they do this for me?" Graham watched Varga resting beside the tiny puppy across the room. Maybe because somebody finally noticed you were trying. Silence settled gently through the house afterward. Peaceful silence. The kind that only arrived after surviving something heavy together. Outside, neighborhood children laughed faintly somewhere down the street while melting snow dripped steadily from rooftops beneath the warming afternoon sun. Milo slowly crawled closer against Varga's side until the little puppy finally fell asleep again beneath the Doberman's watch. Ethan stared at them quietly, emotion filling his face in a way words could no longer carry. Graham eventually stood near the doorway to leave. "You are not alone anymore, son," he said softly before pulling on his gloves. Ethan nodded once, unable to answer. As the front door closed behind Graham, Varga remained exactly where he was beside the sleeping puppy, eyes half open, keeping silent watch over the smallest life he had ever rescued. And for the first time since Claire's death, Ethan finally slept through the night.